Harrison Reed stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the city glitter beneath him like a carpet of diamonds. At 52, he was at the pinnacle of New York's financial elite, CEO of Reed Capital Investments, with a portfolio that made Wall Street veterans tremble with envy. The Forbes list had him comfortably positioned among America's billionaires, a fact he made sure everyone remembered. "Mr. Reed, your 7 p.m. dinner reservation at Le Bernardin has been confirmed," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "And Mrs. Reed's stylist has arrived to help her prepare." Harrison didn't bother to acknowledge the message. These details were insignificant, mechanical parts of a well-oiled machine that functioned around him. In his world, people were assets, or liabilities, nothing more. His wife, Eleanor, was categorized firmly as the former, an investment that had paid dividends in social currency and business connections. Eleanor Reed had been the perfect acquisition 16 years ago, 30 years old then, with classic beauty, impeccable Boston Brahmin pedigree, and a Columbia MBA. The daughter of a former senator, she brought political connections that had proven invaluable as Harrison built his empire. Their marriage was a merger of convenience, a strategic alliance that had served its purpose. "Harrison, could you help with this clasp?" Eleanor's voice floated from their bedroom. He sighed, setting down his whiskey. These mundane requests felt beneath him, but appearances had to be maintained. Tonight's dinner was with the Crawfords. William Crawford being on the Federal Reserve Board, his insights were worth enduring an evening of small talk. Eleanor stood before her vanity mirror, a vision in midnight blue silk. At 46, she remained striking, her chestnut hair styled in a sophisticated updo, her posture perfect, a testament to her New England upbringing. But Harrison looked past all this, seeing only the utility of her presence. "You look appropriate," he said, fastening the diamond necklace he'd given her for their 15th anniversary, not as a token of affection, but as a necessary upgrade to her public image. "Just appropriate?" A small smile played on her lips, but her eyes remained serious. "The Parsons charity auction is next week. I've secured a table near the stage." Harrison nodded curtly. "Good. Crawford mentioned that's where the real discussions happen." He walked away, mission accomplished, missing the slight fall of Eleanor's shoulders. In the car ride downtown, Eleanor reviewed details about their dinner companions on her tablet. "Jessica Crawford has been volunteering with the Metropolitan Museum's education program. It might be nice to mention your recent donation." "I'll decide what's worth mentioning," Harrison replied, scrolling through market reports on his phone. "And make sure you steer conversation away from the West Side development. The acquisition isn't public yet." Eleanor nodded, her face a practiced mask of composure. She'd long ago learned that arguing with Harrison was futile. Their marriage operated on clear terms. She provided social grace and connections, maintained their image, and in return, she lived in luxury. Love had never been part of the equation. Le Bernardin's private dining room hummed with the quiet confidence of extreme wealth. The Crawfords were already seated, William's silver hair and confident posture marking him as a man accustomed to power. "Harrison, Eleanor, wonderful to see you both." Jessica Crawford rose to greet them, her warmth genuine. At 62, she emanated the authentic confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Dinner progressed as these affairs always did. Discussions of market trends, vacation properties, philanthropic endeavors that doubled as tax shelters. Harrison dominated the conversation when business arose, relegating Eleanor to smiling nods and occasional comments about cultural events. "Eleanor, I heard you've been instrumental in the New York Children's Hospital Foundation," Jessica said. During dessert, Eleanor's face softened. "Yes, we've been developing a new wing for pediatric oncology. The treatments available now are remarkable, but the emotional support system still needs—" "Eleanor manages several of our charitable interests," Harrison interrupted. "It keeps her occupied while providing useful tax advantages." A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. William Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly, while Jessica's smile tightened. "Well, I think it's wonderful work," Jessica continued, purposely addressing Eleanor directly. Perhaps we could meet for lunch next week. I'd love to hear more. The evening ended cordially, but in the car ride home, Harrison was displeased. You let Jessica Crawford monopolize the conversation with charity talk. I needed more time with William. I was building rapport, Eleanor replied, fatigue evident in her voice. Jessica influences William's social calendar considerably. Building that relationship could give you more access than forceful networking. Harrison scoffed. I don't need your amateur strategizing. I closed my first billion-dollar deal while you were still planning debutante balls. Eleanor turned to look out the window, the city lights blurring together. 16 years of calculated sleights had taught her when to retreat. Tomorrow would bring another social event, another business dinner, another day of serving as the perfect accessory to a man who saw human connections as transactions. Back at their penthouse, Eleanor removed her jewelry with practiced care. Harrison was already in his study, likely making calls to Asian markets. She sat at her vanity, methodically removing her makeup, studying her reflection. Behind the perfect facade she maintained for Harrison's benefit, something had begun to change in her eyes. She opened her planner, reviewing tomorrow's schedule. Breakfast meeting with the hospital foundation, lunch with potential donors, an afternoon of calls and emails, then a gallery opening with Harrison in the evening. Her life was a carefully curated series of appearances, all designed to enhance her husband's position and power. Eleanor reached for her phone, scrolling to her recent medical reports, encrypted files she'd kept carefully hidden from Harrison. The headaches had started 6 months ago, followed by occasional dizzy spells she'd attributed to stress. When the diagnosis came 3 weeks ago, her first thought wasn't fear but calculation. How would this affect the carefully balanced equation of her marriage? She closed the file and took a deep breath. Tomorrow she would tell him. Tomorrow she would discover whether 16 years of marriage had built anything resembling genuine concern. Tomorrow she would learn if Harrison Reed, a man who valued only what could benefit him, would stand by her when she could no longer provide the perfect image he required. For tonight, she maintained the facade, slipping into silk pajamas and sliding into their king-sized bed, careful to stay on her. Sight of the invisible line that divided them even in sleep. Stage 3 glioblastoma. Dr. Stephanie Chen's voice was gentle but direct as she pointed to the brain scan displayed on her office monitor. The tumor is aggressive, but we have treatment options, Eleanor. Eleanor Reed sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. The same composed posture she maintained during difficult board meetings or tense social events. 3 weeks had passed since her initial diagnosis, and this follow-up appointment only confirmed what she already knew. The headaches will likely increase in frequency, Dr. Chen continued. We should start treatment immediately. I've prepared a comprehensive plan. Eleanor nodded, accepting the folder of information. And the prognosis? Dr. Chen hesitated. With aggressive treatment, we're looking at extending quality of life, but I need to be honest. This type of tumor is challenging. Eleanor understood the careful phrasing, terminal. She was being told, in the gentlest way possible, that she was terminal. Have you told your husband yet? Dr. Chen asked, her expression softening. No, Eleanor replied, tucking the folder into her designer handbag. I'm telling him tonight. As her driver navigated Manhattan traffic, Eleanor rehearsed the conversation in her mind. After 16 years together, she still strategized interactions with Harrison as one would approach a high-stakes negotiation. Their relationship had always operated on clear metrics of value, what each party brought to the table, what benefits could be extracted from the arrangement. She touched her temple, where another headache was beginning to pulse. What value did a sick wife bring to a man like Harrison Reed? The afternoon crawled by in a series of emails and conference calls. Eleanor managed the Reed Family Foundation with the same precision she applied to everything in her life. The foundation had begun as a tax strategy Harrison's accountants recommended, but over the years, it had become her domain, the one area where she exercised genuine control. At 6, Harrison called. I'm skipping dinner, meeting with the Singaporean. Investors ran long. We're continuing over drinks. I need to speak with you, Eleanor said, her voice steady. It's important. Can it wait until tomorrow? These investors are leaving the country. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. No, Harrison. It can't wait. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Harrison wasn't accustomed to Eleanor insisting on anything. Fine, he finally replied. I'll be home by 9. She prepared carefully for the conversation, selecting the small sitting room rather than Harrison's imposing home office. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, rather than the formal attire Harrison preferred for her at home. Tonight wasn't about maintaining appearances. Harrison arrived at 9:45, slightly loosened tie and faint scent of expensive whiskey indicating a successful meeting. He found Eleanor waiting in the sitting room, a rare glass of wine in her hand. This better be important, he said, checking his watch. I have calls with Tokyo at 11. Eleanor took a slow breath. I've been diagnosed with brain cancer, stage 3 glioblastoma. Harrison froze midway to pouring himself a drink. For a brief moment, something like genuine concern flashed across his face. Are you sure? Who's the doctor? We should get other opinions. I'll call Johns Hopkins in the morning. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope at his immediate response. I've already consulted with specialists. Dr. Chen at Memorial Sloan Kettering is one of the best in the country. Harrison nodded, finally pouring his drink and sitting opposite her. What's the treatment plan? Aggressive approach, surgery. First, then radiation and chemotherapy. Timeline? Surgery next week, recovery period, then 6 weeks of combined radiation and chemo, followed by maintenance chemo. Harrison processed this information with the same analytical approach he applied to market reports and investment strategies. We'll need to adjust your public schedule, wigs for the hair loss. The Chamberlain Gala and the winter charity season will need to be reconsidered. Eleanor watched him, the flicker of hope fading. Already, he was calculating the impact on their social calendar, their public image. Harrison, she said quietly, I'm telling you that I have cancer. He looked up, genuinely confused by her tone. I understand that. I'm addressing the practical considerations. What about the emotional considerations? The question slipped out before she could contain a rare breach in her carefully maintained composure. Harrison set down his glass, clearly uncomfortable. What would you have me say, Eleanor, that I'm sorry? Of course I am, that we'll get the best treatment, obviously. But emotional hand-wringing won't shrink tumors. Practical planning will ensure you get through this with minimal disruption. Minimal disruption. The words hung in the air between them. Even now, facing her illness, Harrison's primary concern was maintaining their carefully constructed life, their public image, their social standing. I see, Eleanor said, finishing her wine. We should keep this private for now, Harrison continued, already tapping notes into his phone. I'll have Jessica reschedule your foundation meetings for the next month. We'll need a cover story for the surgery recovery period. Eleanor stood, suddenly exhausted. I'm going to bed. We can discuss details tomorrow. Harrison nodded, already making a call. As she left the room, she heard him speaking to his assistant. Clear my morning calendar. I need to research oncology specialists and treatment centers. In their bedroom, Eleanor methodically removed her makeup and jewelry, the routine automatic after years of practice. Harrison was taking action, arranging for second opinions, researching treatments. To anyone else, this might look like love, like concern. Eleanor knew better. Harrison approached everything, business deals, social connections, and now her illness, as problems to be managed efficiently. She slipped under the covers, staring at the ceiling. 16 years of marriage, and not once had Harrison asked how she felt about the diagnosis. Not once had he offered comfort or shared her fear, because he didn't feel fear for her, only for the potential complications her condition might create in his life. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Harrison had already scheduled appointments with 3 additional specialists. A discreet service had been engaged to provide private nursing care post-surgery. Their social calendar was being quietly rearranged. I've spoken with Bernard at the foundation, Harrison said over breakfast. which for him consisted of black coffee and market reports. He'll handle the day-to-day operations during your treatment. Eleanor nodded, pushing her untouched toast away. The medication for her headaches suppressed her appetite. And I've prepared a statement for when this becomes public knowledge, he continued. We'll control the narrative, emphasize your strength and our privacy during this time. Thank you, Eleanor said automatically. Everything Harrison did was technically correct. He was securing the best medical care, managing their public image, arranging for her responsibilities to be covered. Yet beneath it all, a coldness persisted. He approached her illness as a business problem, not a human tragedy affecting someone he loved. That afternoon, she met with her personal attorney, Thomas Whitfield, under the guise of foundation business. In his wood-paneled office overlooking Central Park, she discussed matters Harrison knew nothing about. Are you certain about this, Eleanor? Thomas asked, concerned. These changes are significant. I'm certain, she replied, and it needs to remain confidential. As she left his office, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond her role in Harrison's life. Her diagnosis had clarified things, stripped away pretenses. Perhaps in the time she had left, she could finally be more than an accessory, more than a strategic alliance. Perhaps she could be the author of her own legacy. 3 weeks after surgery, Eleanor sat in Dr. Chen's office for her follow-up appointment. The procedure had gone as well as could be expected, though recovery had been difficult. Harrison had ensured she received excellent care, private nurses, the best medications, regular visits from specialists. Yet he himself had been notably absent, attending only her initial surgery before delegating her care to the staff he'd hired. The pathology confirms what we suspected, Dr. Chen said, reviewing the results. We removed as much of the tumor as safely possible, but complete resection wasn't achievable. We'll start radiation and chemotherapy next week. Eleanor nodded, touching the scarf that elegantly concealed where they'd shaved her head for surgery. I understand. Dr. Chen hesitated, looking at another set of test results. There's something else, Eleanor, something unexpected in your pre-treatment screening. Eleanor braced herself for worse news. Another tumor? No, Dr. Chen said, her expression softening into a smile. You're pregnant. The words hung in the air, impossible and miraculous. That's not possible, Eleanor whispered. Harrison, and I barely... She stopped herself. It was true that intimacy in their marriage had dwindled to rare mechanical encounters, but there had been one night, shortly before her diagnosis, when Harrison had been unusually attentive after a successful business deal. 6 weeks according to the hormone levels, Dr. Chen confirmed. It's extremely rare in a woman your age, and honestly, it complicates your treatment options considerably. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her abdomen. A child, something she'd given up hoping for years ago after multiple failed fertility treatments early in their marriage. Harrison had eventually declared the efforts inefficient and suggested they move on, citing numerous studies about the advantages of childless executives. This changes your treatment protocol, Dr. Chen continued gently. Some therapies aren't compatible with pregnancy. We need to discuss your options. Eleanor listened as Dr. Chen outlined the modified approach they could take, less aggressive, with greater risks to her own prognosis, but potentially safe for the developing child. I need time to think, Eleanor said finally, and to discuss this with my husband. On the drive home, Eleanor stared out the window, one hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Life growing inside her, even as her own mortality loomed larger. The irony wasn't lost on her. How would Harrison react? Their marriage had always been a business arrangement, not a love match. Harrison viewed children as complications, distractions from wealth accumulation and power consolidation. Several of his colleagues had gone through messy divorces over family disputes, reinforcing his belief that children were financial liabilities rather than emotional assets. Yet this pregnancy felt like a gift, a last chance at something genuine in a life built on appearances. Could it possibly change things between them? Could Harrison see this child as something more than an inconvenience? She found him in his home office, engaged in a video conference with London investors. Through the crack in the door, she could see him in his element, commanding, decisive, ruthlessly effective. This was the Harrison Reed that Wall Street feared and admired. Eleanor waited until his meeting ended before knocking softly. "Come in," he called, not looking up from his tablet. She entered, closing the door behind her. Harrison's office was a showcase of power, awards and recognition from financial institutions, photos with politicians and business leaders, the original painting by a renowned artist that had cost more than most Manhattan apartments. "How was your appointment?" he asked, still reviewing documents. "Unexpected," Eleanor replied, taking a seat across from him. "The surgery was successful, but they couldn't remove everything. Radiation starts next week." Harrison nodded, making a note. "I've arranged for the treatments to be scheduled early mornings to minimize disruption to your routine. The foundation. Gala can still proceed in December if you're feeling up to it." Eleanor took a deep breath. "Harrison, I'm pregnant." His fingers froze over the tablet. For perhaps the third time in their 16-year marriage, she had rendered Harrison Reed speechless. "That's impossible," he finally said, setting down the device. "The fertility specialists years ago." "Apparently they were wrong," Eleanor replied. "I'm 6 weeks along." Harrison's expression shifted through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally settling into something that looked unsettlingly like irritation. "This complicates things," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Complicates things?" Eleanor repeated, a chill settling over her. "I'm telling you that despite everything, my age, my health, our history of infertility, we've somehow conceived a child, and your response is that it complicates things." Harrison stood, pacing to the window. "Be realistic, Eleanor. You have brain cancer, aggressive brain cancer. You're about to start radiation and chemotherapy, and now pregnancy hormones? The timing couldn't be worse." Eleanor felt something snap inside her, a restraint that had held for 16 years of marriage. "Worse for whom, Harrison? For you, because having a sick wife was already inconvenient enough, and now a baby makes it even messier." He turned, genuinely surprised by her outburst. "I'm being practical. Your health has to be the priority." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "For you, the priority has always been optics, how things look, how they affect your business interests and social position." "That's unfair," Harrison replied, his tone cooling. "I've ensured you have the best medical care available." "Because a wife dying reflects poorly on a man of your stature," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. "Not because you care about me as a person, as your partner." Harrison's expression hardened. "We've had a mutually beneficial arrangement for 16 years, Eleanor. Don't pretend it was something else because you're facing mortality." The brutal honesty stunned her into silence. In all their years together, they had maintained the fiction of a normal marriage, never explicitly acknowledging its transactional nature. "And now?" she asked finally. "What about this child?" Harrison sighed, returning to his desk. "It's your decision, of course, but be realistic about what this means. The stress of pregnancy could accelerate your condition. The treatments that might extend your life could harm the fetus. And afterward..." He left the sentence unfinished. "Afterward," Eleanor continued for him, "you'd be left with a child you never wanted." Harrison didn't deny it. "I built my life around certain choices, Eleanor, choices we both agreed upon when we married. This development wasn't part of the plan." Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. For years, she had maintained the perfect facade as Harrison Reed's wife, suppressing her own desires and emotions to fulfill her role in their arrangement. Now facing her mortality and this unexpected new life, the facade no longer mattered. "I'm keeping this baby," she said simply. "I'll modify my treatment plan accordingly." Eleanor, be reasonable. "No, Harrison, for once I'm not going to be reasonable. I'm not going to calculate social advantages or financial implications. I'm going to be human." She left his office without waiting for his response. In their bedroom, she caught her reflection in the vanity mirror, the elegant scarf covering Her surgical sight, the slight pallor from medications, but also something new in her eyes: determination. The next morning, Harrison was coldly polite at breakfast, reviewing his schedule without mentioning their conversation. "I have meetings. In Chicago tomorrow," he said, checking his watch. "I'll be gone 3 days." Eleanor nodded, sipping her tea. Once his trips had bothered her, not from jealousy, but from the knowledge that his absence meant he was pursuing advantageous connections without her social facilitation. Now, she welcomed the space. "While you're gone, I'll be meeting with Dr. Chen to adjust my treatment plan," she informed him, "and with Thomas Whitfield about some foundation matters." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Whitfield, I thought Bernard was handling foundation business during your treatment." "Some matters require my personal attorney," Eleanor replied evenly. For a moment, something like suspicion flickered across Harrison's face, but he dismissed it quickly. In his world, Eleanor had always been predictable, controllable. "Fine," he said, rising from the table. "Just make sure whatever you're planning doesn't create complications for the year-end tax strategy." After he left, Eleanor placed her hand on her stomach where her child, their child, was growing against all odds. "It's just us now," she whispered, "and I promise you'll know more love in however much time we have together than I've known in 16 years of marriage." The modified treatment plan took its toll on Eleanor's body. Dr. Chen had crafted a delicate balance, enough radiation and chemotherapy to slow the tumor's growth, but not so aggressive that it would harm the developing baby. Each week brought Eleanor back. To the hospital, where the private suite Harrison had arranged became her second home. She'd begun showing just enough that loose clothing could no longer completely conceal her condition. At 12 weeks, the morning sickness that had plagued her finally began to subside, replaced by a fragile energy that allowed her to maintain at least some appearances. Harrison maintained his distance, physically and emotionally. He attended critical medical appointments, asked clinical questions about her treatment protocol, ensured all bills were paid promptly, but never once acknowledged the pregnancy in personal terms. He spoke of the fetus and the condition with the same detached tone he used for market corrections or underperforming investments. "The Walton Foundation dinner is next Thursday," Harrison reminded her over a breakfast he barely touched, already scrolling through emails on his phone. "Your blue Valentino should still fit without drawing attention." Eleanor set down her teacup. "I'm not hiding this anymore, Harrison." He looked up, instantly alert. "We agreed to keep this private until necessary." "No," Eleanor corrected him, gently. "You decided that. I never agreed." Harrison's expression hardened. "Eleanor, be reasonable. Your condition is already generating enough gossip. Adding pregnancy to the mix will create a media circus, especially given your prognosis." "My prognosis?" Eleanor repeated, the words still strange in her mouth. "You mean the fact that I'm dying?" Harrison flinched almost imperceptibly at her bluntness. In their careful world of euphemisms and polite fictions, such direct acknowledgement was jarring. "The treatments are showing promise," he said, retreating to safer ground. "Dr. Chen mentioned the tumor hasn't grown since surgery." "It hasn't shrunk either," Eleanor pointed out, "and we both know the modified treatment protocol significantly reduces its effectiveness." She placed a protective hand over her small but visible bump. "This child deserves acknowledgement, Harrison. I won't pretend it doesn't exist to make your business dinners more comfortable." Harrison stood, straightening his already perfect tie. "Do what you want, Eleanor. You always do these days." The comment stung with its unfairness. For 16 years, Eleanor had subjugated her wants and needs to Harrison's expectations. Only now, facing mortality, had she begun to assert herself. After Harrison left for his office, Eleanor met with Jessica Bradford, a longtime Foundation board member who had become a genuine friend, perhaps her only one in their social circle. "You look wonderful," Jessica said, embracing Eleanor in the penthouse living room. Her eyes widened upon noticing Eleanor's condition. "My God, are you—" Eleanor smiled, placing Jessica's hand on her bump. 12 weeks. A miracle given. Everything. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Eleanor, I don't know whether to congratulate you or—" She stopped, uncertain. "Both are appropriate," Eleanor said, leading her friend to the sofa. "It's beautiful and terrible at once." "And Harrison?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Harrison sees it as an inconvenience, a complication." Jessica's expression hardened. That man! I've never understood how someone so brilliant in business could be so emotionally stunted. "We had an arrangement," Eleanor said simply. "I always knew what I was agreeing to." "And now?" Jessica asked gently. "Now I'm making new arrangements," Eleanor replied, her hand protectively over her stomach. "Jessica, I need to ask you something important." That evening, Eleanor attended the New York Children's Hospital benefit alone, her first public appearance since her surgery, where she made no attempt to conceal her pregnancy. The whispers followed her through the ballroom, but for once Eleanor didn't care about managing perceptions or controlling narratives. Mrs. Reed, Dr. Abernathy, the hospital's chief of oncology, approached her with warm concern. "I've heard about your situation from colleagues at Memorial Sloan. How are you managing?" "One day at a time," Eleanor replied honestly. "The baby complicates treatment options but makes each day more meaningful." Dr. Abernathy nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Many of our patients with children say the same thing, that having someone to fight for gives them strength." "I never thought I'd have this chance," Eleanor admitted, allowing herself a vulnerability she would have considered unacceptable months ago. "After years of trying early in our marriage, we'd given up." "Life finds a way," Dr. Abernathy said kindly, "sometimes when we least expect it." The evening continued, Eleanor accepting both congratulations and concerned looks with equal grace. By the time she returned home, she was exhausted but strangely fulfilled. Harrison was waiting in the living room, a rare glass of scotch in his hand. "I heard you made quite an impression tonight." Eleanor removed her earrings, too tired for conflict. "I was honest, Harrison. Something we should try more often." "Margaret Sinclair called me," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Apparently she's terribly concerned about my brave wife and her difficult situation. The entire board of Sinclair Investments now knows my wife has terminal cancer and is inexplicably pregnant." "Good," Eleanor said, sitting across from him. "Perhaps honesty will be refreshing for everyone." Harrison set down his glass with careful precision. 16 years, Eleanor. 16 years of careful image management, strategic relationship building, precisely calibrated public appearances. And you're dismantling it all because of sentimentality over a pregnancy that should never have happened. The cruelty of his words hung in the air between them. "You know what I realized recently, Harrison?" Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I realized that I've spent 16 years being exactly who you needed me to be. The perfect corporate wife, the elegant hostess, the socially connected asset. And not once did you see me, the actual person beneath all those roles." "I saw you clearly from the beginning," Harrison countered. "We both understood the arrangement." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, rising to leave. "We did. But understanding an arrangement doesn't make it fulfilling. It doesn't make it human." 2 days later, during a routine checkup, Eleanor felt the first cramping sensation. By evening, the pain had intensified. Harrison was in Washington for meetings with legislators about financial regulations, so it was Jessica Bradford who accompanied her to the emergency room. "Call my husband," Eleanor managed through waves of pain as medical staff rushed around her. Hours later, Harrison arrived at the hospital to find Jessica waiting outside Eleanor's room. "She lost the baby," Jessica said, her usual diplomatic composure abandoned. "She's been asking for you." Harrison straightened his tie, a reflexive gesture of control. "What happened?" "What happened?" Jessica repeated, her voice rising. "What happened is that your wife, who is fighting brain cancer, who is undergoing grueling treatments, who has been carrying your child alone because you couldn't be bothered to show basic human compassion, your wife just experienced one of the most devastating losses imaginable." "That's what happened, Harrison." For once, Harrison Reed had no calculated response. He entered Eleanor's room with uncharacteristic hesitation. She lay in the hospital bed, pale against the white sheets, an IV delivering fluids to her arm. The careful facade she'd maintained for 16 years was gone, replaced by raw grief. "Eleanor," he said, standing awkwardly by her bedside. "I came as soon as I heard." "It was a girl," she whispered, not looking at him. "They told me it was a girl." Harrison shifted uncomfortably. This was emotional territory he had no map for, no strategy to navigate. "The doctors said the stress of the cancer treatments likely contributed," he offered, retreating to medical facts where he felt safer. Eleanor finally turned to look at him, her eyes clear despite her grief. "Do you feel anything, Harrison? Anything at all?" The question caught him off guard. "Of course I do. This is unfortunate." "Unfortunate," Eleanor repeated, turning away again. That's exactly the word a human being would use for the loss of their child. Harrison stood silently, aware that he was failing some crucial test, but unsure how to correct course. "Please leave," Eleanor said finally. "Jessica will stay with me tonight." "Eleanor, be reasonable." "Leave, Harrison," she repeated, her voice stronger. "For once in our marriage, give me what I'm asking for instead of what you think I should want." He left, relief mixing uncomfortably with an unfamiliar feeling that might have been shame. In the corridor, Jessica Bradford gave him a look of such undisguised contempt that even Harrison Reed, insulated by wealth and power, felt its sting. After losing the baby, Eleanor retreated into herself. She spent days in the guest bedroom, unable to return to the master suite she had shared with Harrison, sleeping fitfully between bouts of grief that left her physically exhausted. The loss had compounded her already fragile health, forcing Dr. Chen to temporarily suspend her treatments. Harrison maintained his distance, uncomfortable with raw emotion. He arranged for additional nursing staff, ensured Eleanor had whatever material comfort she required, and then buried himself in work, spending longer hours at the office and taking an unexpected business trip to London that coincided with what would have been an important follow-up appointment. On the third week after her loss, Eleanor woke to find a clarity she hadn't expected, a strange calm determination that felt like a lens suddenly coming into focus. The grief remained, a hollow vault that would never fully heal, but alongside it grew something new: purpose. She dressed carefully that morning, selecting a simple but elegant outfit that had once been her armor for difficult board meetings. She arranged her silk scarf over her growing back hair and applied makeup for the first time since the hospital. When she entered the kitchen, Harrison looked up from his tablet with poorly concealed surprise. "So you're up," he observed unnecessarily. "Are you feeling better?" "No," Eleanor replied honestly, "but I'm functioning." Harrison nodded, clearly relieved that she appeared to be returning to her expected role. "Good. Dr. Chen called yesterday. She wants to resume your treatments next week." "I've already spoken with her," Eleanor said, pouring herself tea. "I'm seeing her this afternoon." Harrison checked his watch. "I have meetings until 6, but I could have Davis drive you." "Jessica is taking me," Eleanor interrupted, "and afterward I'm meeting with Thomas Whitfield." Harrison frowned. "Your attorney again?" "Eleanor, if this is about the foundation, Bernard has everything under control. You should be focusing on your recovery." "This isn't about the foundation," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze directly. "This is about my will." The words hung between them, stark and unavoidable. For months they had discussed her illness in euphemisms and medical terminology, carefully avoiding direct acknowledgement of her prognosis. "That's premature," Harrison replied, discomfort evident in his stiff posture. "Is it?" Eleanor asked, quietly. "We both know what Dr. Chen's statistics mean, Harrison. The 5-year survival rate for glioblastoma is less than 5%. With the treatment interruptions due to the pregnancy and now this setback, my odds are even lower." Harrison set down his tablet. "Medical statistics are generalizations. Your case could be different." "It could be," Eleanor agreed, "but I need to be prepared either way." "Fine," Harrison said, retreating to the familiar territory of financial planning. "I'll have Peterson from the family office coordinate with Whitfield. There are tax considerations that should be addressed, particularly regarding the foundation endowment. Eleanor sipped her tea, watching him begin to construct the practical framework that allowed him to process difficult realities. I'm handling this myself, Harrison. There are certain matters I want to arrange personally. Something in her tone made Harrison look up sharply. What does that mean? It means that after 16 years of marriage, I've earned the right to make some independent decisions about my legacy. Harrison's expression hardened. Need I remind you that most of what you're distributing came from my work, my investments? Need I remind you, Eleanor countered calmly, that New York is an equitable distribution state, and that prenuptial agreements can be challenged, particularly when one party's circumstances have dramatically changed. Harrison stared at her, genuinely shocked. In 16 years, Eleanor had never once referenced legal leverage or challenged his control of their finances. You're not thinking clearly, he said finally. The grief, the medications, they're affecting your judgment. On the contrary, Eleanor replied, rising from the table, for the first time in years, I'm thinking with perfect clarity. That afternoon, in Thomas Whitfield's office, Eleanor finalized the documents she had been preparing since her initial diagnosis. Thomas, who had been her personal attorney since before her marriage, reviewed the final provisions with concern. Are you absolutely certain about this, Eleanor? It's unconventional. I'm certain, she replied, signing where indicated. Harrison has always valued control above all else, control of assets, of appearances, of narratives. This ensures he receives exactly what he truly values. Thomas nodded reluctantly. I'll file these immediately and update the instructions for the safe deposit box. Speaking of which, did you bring the item? Eleanor removed a small package from her handbag, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. Yes, this is the final piece. 2. Days later, Harrison returned from his office earlier than usual to find Eleanor in the living room with Jessica Bradford and 2 other women from the hospital foundation. Spread across the coffee table were foundation documents, fundraising plans, and architectural renderings for the new pediatric oncology wing. Ladies, Harrison acknowledged them with a nod that clearly suggested the meeting should conclude. I didn't realize we were hosting today. We're finishing up, Eleanor assured him, exchanging knowing glances with Jessica. We've just secured an anonymous 7-figure donation for the children's art therapy program. After the women left, Harrison poured himself a scotch. You seem energized. I am, Eleanor confirmed. The foundation work has always been meaningful to me, but now it feels urgent, essential. Harrison studied her over the rim of his glass. Dr. Chen mentioned you've refused the more aggressive treatment option she recommended. I've chosen quality of life over marginally extended time, Eleanor explained. The side effects of that protocol would leave me unable to complete the work I need to finish. And what work is that exactly? Harrison asked, unable to keep the suspicion from his voice. Eleanor smiled, a genuine expression that caught him off guard. Creating a legacy that matters, Harrison. Something more meaningful than merger announcements and quarterly earnings reports. Those meaningless earnings reports paid for this penthouse, your foundation, and the medical care keeping you alive, he reminded her coldly. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged, and I'm grateful for the comfort they've provided. But comfort isn't purpose, Harrison. It never has been. Over the next few months, a strange new rhythm developed in the Reed household. Eleanor threw herself into foundation work with unprecedented vigor, personally overseeing the development of the new oncology wing. She made public appearances when her strength allowed, no longer concerned with concealing her condition. Harrison watched this transformation with growing unease. The carefully curated wife he had selected for her pedigree and social grace had been replaced by someone unpredictable, someone who made decisions without consulting him, someone who spoke publicly about her illness and their lost child with a candor that made Manhattan society both uncomfortable and strangely admiring. The Wall Street Journal wants to profile you for their Women in Philanthropy series, Harrison informed her one evening. tossing the email printout onto the coffee table. "Apparently, your courage in the face of terminal illness is inspiring." Eleanor glanced at the printout. "I'll consider it. It could bring valuable attention to the Foundation's work." "They'll ask personal questions," Harrison warned, "about your health, about the pregnancy, about our marriage." "Yes," Eleanor agreed calmly. "They probably will." "And you'll answer them?" Harrison asked, an edge in his voice. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I'll tell the truth, Harrison, not the whole truth. I still have some regard for your privacy and our history, but I won't perpetuate the fiction that our marriage has been something it wasn't." Harrison's jaw tightened. 16 years, Eleanor. 16 years of mutual benefit, of strategic partnership, of shared success. "Successful by what measure?" Eleanor asked softly. "Financial assets? Social position? Those were always your metrics, Harrison, not mine." "They were the terms we agreed upon," he insisted. "Yes," Eleanor acknowledged, "and I fulfilled my part of that bargain faithfully for 16 years. But I'm measuring success differently now." Harrison shook his head, frustrated by his inability to steer her back to predictable patterns. "What do you want, Eleanor? What is all this leading to?" She considered the question carefully. "I want meaning in whatever time I have left. I want to know that my existence mattered for something beyond being Harrison Reed's perfect corporate wife. And I want you to recognize just once that I'm a human being with value beyond what I contribute to your bottom line." Harrison stared at her, genuinely bewildered. "I've never said you didn't have value." "You never had to say it," Eleanor replied. "You demonstrated it in 1,000 small ways every day for 16 years. The conversation ended there, as most of their meaningful exchanges did, unresolved, with Harrison retreating to his study and Eleanor left contemplating how much had changed and how much never would. 3 weeks later, after a routine MRI, Dr. Chen delivered the news they had been expecting but dreading. The tumor was growing again, more aggressively than before. "We have options," Dr. Chen said gently. "Experimental treatments, clinical trials." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her decision already made. "How long without additional treatment?" Dr. Chen hesitated. 3 months, perhaps 4, with palliative care to manage symptoms. Harrison, who had accompanied her to this appointment, spoke for the first time. "That's unacceptable. There must be something." "It's my decision, Harrison," Eleanor said firmly. "And I've made it. Quality over quantity." In the car ride home, Harrison broke their tense silence. "This is irrational, Eleanor. There are treatments available. Experimental, yes, but with potential to extend my life by weeks, while making those weeks unbearable," Eleanor finished for him. "No, Harrison. I'm spending my remaining time conscious and purposeful, not drugged and incapacitated in a hospital bed." "So you're just giving up?" he demanded, genuine anger breaking through his usual controlled facade. Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised by his vehemence. "Why does it matter to you, Harrison? In practical terms, wouldn't my passing be simpler? No more medical bills, no more unpredictable public appearances, no more inconvenient emotions to navigate." The key. Words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. "That's not fair," Harrison said finally, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Isn't it?" Eleanor asked. "When have you ever shown genuine concern for me as a person rather than an asset? When have you ever put my needs above your convenience?" Harrison had no answer. As autumn painted Central Park in shades of amber and gold, Eleanor Reed made her final public appearance at the dedication of the new pediatric oncology wing bearing her name. Despite her weakened condition, she stood proudly at the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the assembled donors, medical staff, and press. "Life offers us choices at every turn," she told the crowd, her elegant appearance belying the illness consuming her. "We can choose wealth without purpose, power without compassion, success without meaning. Or we can choose to leave the world better than we found it, to transform our personal pain into collective healing." From his position in the front row, Harrison watched his wife with an expression that even his closest business associates couldn't decipher. Pride, regret, something else entirely? Whatever emotions stirred behind his carefully maintained facade, they remained his secret. The weeks that followed saw Eleanor's decline accelerate. She had chosen home hospice care over hospitalization, converting the penthouse's guest suite into a peaceful sanctuary overlooking the park. Jessica Bradford coordinated a rotation of close foundation colleagues to ensure Eleanor was never alone during Harrison's frequent absences. On a crisp November morning, Harrison returned from a breakfast meeting to find Dr. Chen emerging from Eleanor's room. "She's asking for you," the doctor said quietly. "It won't be long now." Harrison nodded, betraying no emotion as he straightened his tie and entered the room. Eleanor lay propped against pillows, gazing out at the morning light filtering through nearly bare trees. She looked smaller somehow, as though she were already beginning to fade from the world. "Harrison," she acknowledged him, her voice thin but composed. "Thank you for coming." He stood awkwardly at the foot of her bed, a man accustomed to controlling every situation, suddenly finding himself utterly powerless. "Dr. Chen says you're comfortable," he offered, retreating to practical matters as he always did when emotions threatened to intrude. "As comfortable as one can be," Eleanor replied with a ghost of her former wry smile. "Harrison, there's something I need to tell you." He moved closer, taking the chair beside her bed. "You should rest. We can discuss whatever it is later." "There won't be a later," Eleanor said simply. "We both know that." The blunt acknowledgement hung between them, impossible to deny or deflect. "I've changed my will," she continued. "Thomas Whitfield has the details. Most of my personal assets will go to the foundation, specifically to the art therapy program for children with terminal illnesses." Harrison nodded stiffly. "That seems appropriate." "I've left something for you as well," Eleanor added. "Something important. You'll find it in Safe Deposit Box 2187 at First Manhattan Trust. Thomas has the key." "Eleanor, I don't need—" "It's important, Harrison," she interrupted, a hint of her old strength flaring briefly. "Promise me you'll retrieve it personally, not through assistants or proxies. You yourself." Harrison frowned but nodded. "If it matters to you, I will." "It matters," she assured him. "It's the most valuable thing I have to give you." That evening, as snowflakes began drifting past the penthouse windows, Eleanor Reed slipped away quietly in her sleep, Jessica Bradford holding one hand and, surprisingly, Harrison holding the other. Her face in repose held a serenity that had eluded her in life, as though in letting go she had finally found peace. The funeral was exactly as New York society expected for someone of Eleanor Reed's stature: elegant, tasteful, well attended by financial titans and social elites, many of whom had known Eleanor only as Harrison's perfectly poised wife. Politicians praised her philanthropy. Foundation colleagues spoke of her vision. Childhood friends shared polished anecdotes that revealed little of substance. Harrison sat in the front pew, immaculate in custom-tailored mourning attire, his expression appropriate but inscrutable. Beside him sat Vanessa Palmer, a divorced art dealer whose relationship with Harrison had begun discreetly 3 months earlier, when Eleanor's prognosis became terminal. Her presence, while not officially acknowledged, was noted by the gossip, columnists and society bloggers who documented every nuance of the service. 2 days after the funeral, the reading of Eleanor's will took place in Thomas Whitfield's office. Harrison arrived precisely on time, Vanessa accompanying him despite not being specifically invited, a pointed assertion of their relationship now that propriety no longer required discretion. "Mr. Reed," Thomas greeted him with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask his personal disapproval. "Ms. Palmer," he added, his tone cooling several degrees. The preliminaries proceeded as expected. Eleanor's jewelry collection, except for specific bequests to friends, went to the foundation to be auctioned for funding. Her personal artwork, selected with genuine passion rather than investment potential, was donated to various museums and children's hospitals. Her clothing would be sold through a high-end consignment service, proceeds again directed to the foundation. As to financial assets, Thomas continued. Mrs. Reed has directed that her personal investment portfolio, valued at approximately $43 million, be transferred to the Eleanor Reed Foundation for Children's Oncology Arts, with specific allocations detailed in Appendix C. Harrison's expression didn't change, though Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him. Despite their prenuptial agreement, which protected most of Harrison's fortune, Eleanor's personal wealth, accumulated through her own family money and savvy investments, was substantial. He had assumed it would return to his control upon her passing. Additionally, Thomas continued, Mrs. Reed specifically mentioned Safe Deposit Box 2187 at First Manhattan Trust, which contains an item she described as of particular value. To Mr. Reed personally, he slid an envelope across the desk, the key and access documentation. Harrison took the envelope without comment. "Is that all?" Vanessa asked, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. Thomas regarded her coolly. "Mrs. Reed's will is quite clear and comprehensive. All assets have been accounted for and distributed according to her explicit wishes." As they left the attorney's office, Vanessa couldn't contain her frustration. $43 million to finger, painting for sick children? That's absurd, Harrison. Surely there's some way to challenge it. Harrison's expression remained neutral. Eleanor's will is ironclad. Thomas Whitfield is too thorough for loopholes. "But it's your money," Vanessa insisted. "You earned it." "Most of my assets were protected by our prenuptial agreement," Harrison replied. "What Eleanor did with her personal funds was her decision." Vanessa studied him with narrowing eyes. "You're not even upset about this?" "It's done," Harrison said simply. "I have a meeting with First Manhattan Trust at 2 o'clock. Would you prefer I drop you at Bergdorf's or your gallery?" The following afternoon, Harrison Reed sat alone in a private consultation room at First Manhattan Trust, Safe Deposit Box 2187 on the table before him. Its modest size suggested jewelry, perhaps, or documents, stock certificates or property deeds that Eleanor had kept separate from their joint holdings. He inserted the key, turned it, and lifted the lid. Inside lay no jewelry, no valuable documents. Only a mirror, elegant, silver-framed, sized to fit perfectly in the box. Beside it rested an envelope with his name written in Eleanor's distinctive hand. Harrison lifted the mirror first, examining it with a frown. It appeared to be an antique sterling silver hand mirror, the kind that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. Nothing about it suggested special value or significance. He opened the envelope, unfolding the single sheet of monogrammed stationery. Inside, Harrison, "If you're reading this, I've left this world, and you're likely confused about your inheritance. You've spent your life believing that value lies in financial assets, in possessions, in control. You've accumulated wealth beyond imagination, yet remained paradoxically impoverished in every way that truly matters. This mirror reflects the only thing you've ever truly loved, the only companion who's never disappointed you, the only person whose approval you've genuinely sought. For 16 years, I tried to be more than a reflection of your expectations, more than an accessory to your ambitions. I failed, not because I was inadequate, but because you were incapable of seeing beyond yourself. My final gift to you is truth, Harrison. Look closely at your reflection. That man is all you have left, all you've ever truly wanted. I hope someday he becomes someone worthy of being loved, with more compassion than you deserve. Eleanor." Harrison stared at the letter, reading it once, twice, a third time. Something unfamiliar and uncomfortable bloomed in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but a strange amalgamation that felt dangerously close to shame. He lifted the mirror again, forcing himself to look at his own reflection. The face that stared back was outwardly unchanged, still handsome, still commanding, still the visage of Harrison Reed, financial titan. Yet something in the eyes seemed different, as though Eleanor's words had penetrated the carefully constructed armor he'd maintained for a lifetime. The bank officer knocked discreetly. "Mr. Reed, is there anything else you require?" Harrison set down the mirror. "No, that will be all." He left the bank, mirror and letter tucked into his briefcase, and instructed his driver to take him to the office rather than home. Work had always been his refuge, his sanctuary from emotional complexities. That evening, when he finally returned to the penthouse, Vanessa was waiting, elegant in a new dress that suggested she'd indeed stopped at Bergdorf's after being dropped off. "There you are," she greeted him. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten our dinner reservation at Le Bernardin. What was in the safe deposit box?" Harrison set his briefcase on the table. "Nothing of importance." "It must have been something," Vanessa pressed. "Eleanor specifically mentioned it in her will." "A family heirloom," Harrison replied dismissively. "Sentimental value only." Vanessa studied him, her practiced smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Well, that's disappointing. I was hoping for at least some jewelry." Eleanor had excellent taste in diamonds. She glanced at her watch. "We should leave in 20 minutes to make our reservation." Harrison watched her move toward the bedroom to retrieve her wrap, suddenly seeing her with uncomfortable clarity. She was beautiful, socially connected and completely transactional. A younger, less subtle version of the arrangement he'd had with Eleanor. The realization was unsettling. "Vanessa," he called after her. "I'm not feeling well. You should go without me." She turned, surprise evident on her perfect features. "Harrison Reed cancelling a power dinner at Le Bernardin. That's unlike you." "Perhaps I'm changing," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Vanessa's expression shifted to one of calculation. "This is about Eleanor, isn't it? Whatever was in that safe deposit box as you rattled." Harrison didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "You know what's strange?" Vanessa continued, her tone sharpening. "In all the time we've been together, you've barely mentioned her. Your wife of 16 years was dying, and you spoke about her like a business associate facing retirement." "Our marriage was complicated," Harrison replied stiffly. "No," Vanessa corrected him. "It was exactly what you wanted it to be." "What? All your relationships are arrangements of mutual benefit without emotional entanglement." She collected her purse. "I understood the terms, Harrison. I just thought I'd be upgrading to wife status now that the position is vacant." The crudeness of her assessment struck Harrison like a physical blow. Was this how Eleanor had felt? All those years, like an interchangeable part in his carefully constructed life. "I think we should take some time apart," he said finally. Vanessa laughed, the sound entirely devoid of humor. "Of course, the great Harrison Reed, always in control of every situation. Fine. Call me when you've processed your convenient grief. Or don't." She moved toward the door, then paused. "You know what everyone says about you, Harrison, that you're brilliant but hollow, that there's nothing behind the perfect facade. I defended you, told them you were simply private, guarded. But they were right, weren't they?" After she left, Harrison stood alone in the vast penthouse that suddenly felt like a museum to a life he'd constructed, but never fully inhabited. Eleanor's presence lingered in 1,000 small details. The books she'd read, the art she'd selected, the spaces she'd occupied. He retrieved the mirror from his briefcase, forcing himself to look again at his reflection. The face that stared back seemed less certain now, less assured. In his pocket, his phone vibrated with messages. Business associates, social connections, perhaps Vanessa, already regretting her dramatic exit. He ignored them all, continuing to study his reflection as snow began falling outside the windows, shrouding the city in silence. For the first time in his adult life, Harrison Reed confronted the possibility that he had built an empire of wealth and influence while remaining utterly impoverished in ways that truly mattered. The realization didn't bring immediate transformation. Character seldom changes in an instant, but it planted a seed of uncomfortable truth that refused to be ignored. Eleanor's final gift had been neither revenge nor punishment, but the one thing she had never been able to give him during their marriage: self-awareness. In the days and weeks that followed, New York society whispered about Harrison Reed's strange behavior, declining high-profile social invitations, withdrawing from boards, where he'd once dominated, making substantial anonymous donations to Eleanor's foundation. Some speculated grief, others suggested business troubles or health concerns. None guessed the truth, that Harrison Reed was grappling with the emptiness of a life measured only in acquisitions and achievements, confronting the hollow inheritance of a man who had loved only himself. Whether this reckoning would lead to genuine change or merely a more sophisticated form of self-interest remained to be seen. But on a snowy December afternoon, he stood alone at Eleanor's grave, no cameras present, no social advantage to be gained, and placed a single white rose atop the marble headstone. "I see you now," he whispered, words meant only for her. "Too late, but I see you." And for the first time in a life defined by calculation and control, Harrison Reed allowed himself to weep for what he had lost. Not the perfect corporate wife he had acquired like an asset, but the human being he had never truly known, whose worth he had failed to recognize until she was gone. Fim de Historia. Dear listeners, we hope Harrison Reed's journey of realization has touched your heart. Sometimes we only see the true value of what we have when it's gone forever. Life gives us countless opportunities to choose meaning over materialism, connection over control, and love over appearance. For more stories that explore the complex nature of relationships and personal transformation, click the subscribe button on your left. If this story moved you, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments section. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that examine the depth of human experience. Don't miss our upcoming content. Your next favorite story is waiting for you. We look forward to reading your comments.